Once upon a time, in a big, noisy city, there lived a young man named Edward. He wasn't rich, and he didn't have a fancy lab, but he had one thing that made him stand out: a big dream. Edward wanted to be the greatest scientist ever. The only problem? He was super poor. His tiny apartment was so small that he could touch both walls without stretching. His lab was just a bunch of broken gadgets, old books, and piles of junk. But Edward didn't care. He knew his genius would shine one day. People laughed at him. "What's this guy doing with all that trash?" they'd say. "He's never going to make anything useful." Edward just smiled and thought, "Wait for it. One day, you'll see." One day, while rummaging around in a junkyard, his favorite place, Edward found something amazing: a rusted old car. It was barely hanging together, with missing doors and wheels that looked like they belonged on a bicycle. But Edward's eyes lit up. "I can make this car travel through time," he shouted, almost scaring a stray cat. People walking by shook their heads and giggled. "Time travel? That old pile of junk?" They laughed. But Edward just grinned, already dreaming of the future. With some old wires, random buttons, and a whole lot of duct tape, he set to work. For the next few weeks, his apartment sounded like a war zone. There were explosions. Oops, sparks flying. Okay, maybe too many sparks. And even a few minor electrical fires. Nothing a bucket of water couldn't handle. Neighbors banged on the walls, but Edward just yelled back, "It's the sound of the future." Finally, after what felt like a million failed experiments, Edward was done. The car didn't look like much. A mess of glowing lights, strange buttons, and wires sticking out in all directions. But Edward didn't care. He climbed into the car, pushed the biggest red button he could find. It said, "Time travel, do not press." And zap! The car shook violently. Lights flashed, and before Edward knew it, everything went bam. When he opened his eyes, Edward couldn't believe what he saw. He wasn't in his tiny apartment anymore. He wasn't even in his time anymore. He was in a futuristic city. Flying cars zipped by, robots were walking around helping people, and the air smelled like fresh pizza. Fresh pizza. Edward's stomach rumbled. Did I just travel through time? Edward gasped. He looked around and saw a giant building with a glowing sign. Edward Labs, innovating the future. Wait, what? He rubbed his eyes. That sign had his name on it. Without wasting a second, Edward ran inside the building like a kid in a candy store. Inside, there were scientists, engineers, and what? A giant robot with his face on it. "Edward? The Edward?" a group of kids asked him, holding up their tablets. "You invented time travel. Your inventions changed everything." Edward's brain exploded. "Me? I did all this?" he said, shaking his head like he was dreaming. The kids nodded, laughing. "You invented flying cars, robots, and pizza in the air. Your work made the future amazing." Edward's jaw dropped. "Wait, so I made all of this?" he asked, looking at the flying cars and the pizza-smelling air. One of the kids laughed. "Yeah, you changed the world by believing in your ideas, no matter how crazy they seemed. And now, this is the future." Edward grinned from ear to ear. He couldn't believe it. But then he looked around and realized something even more important. It wasn't just the flying cars and robots that made this future great. It was the people using them wisely, working together to make life better for everyone. As cool as the future was, Edward knew he had to go back. There was still so much to do in his own time. He couldn't stay forever. So he jumped back in his time car, pressed the big red button, and poof! He was back in his tiny apartment, surrounded by his broken gadgets. But now, Edward was more determined than ever. From that day forward, Edward worked even harder. He built more crazy gadgets, entered more competitions, and slowly started getting noticed. People stopped laughing at him and started taking him seriously. And before long, Edward became a world-renowned inventor. Years later, Edward's future came true. The flying cars, robots, and pizza in the air were all real. And it all started with his crazy idea. But Edward knew the real lesson wasn't about time travel. It was about believing in yourself and never giving up. Moral of the story: no idea is too crazy. No dream is too big. Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do it. If you believe in yourself and never stop trying, you can create a future more amazing than you ever imagined.
Never ever give up. If you want more awesome stories and inspiration, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube and follow me on Instagram. See you there.